At 0347 hours, he understood the situation completely. The unit was gone, not retreating, not regrouping somewhere ahead. Gone. The last transmission had cut out mid-sentence. No static, no signal, just silence where there had been voices 30 seconds before. He was alone in a forest that now belonged to someone else, and they were already moving. He had perhaps 8 minutes before the first sweep team reached his position. What no one understood, yet what he himself was only beginning to realize, was that the only way to survive this was to do the one thing every instinct, every instructor, every protocol told him not to do: stay exactly where he was. The year is 1944. The Hirchen forest sits on the German-Belgian border, like a wound that refuses to close. For 3 months it has swallowed men whole, American and German alike, and returned nothing useful to either side. A reconnaissance scout attached to a small forward unit tasked with probing the eastern edge of the tree line before dawn. The probe went wrong before it started. Now the unit is silent, the forest is not. And he is lying face down in frozen undergrowth, with 8 minutes, maybe less, before the first German sweep team closes the distance between them and him. He does not know the exact size of the force surrounding him. He knows it is large enough to have taken his entire unit in under 90 seconds. That tells him enough. Standard protocol for an isolated soldier behind enemy lines is immediate evasion. Move fast. Move outward. Put distance between yourself and the point of contact. Find friendly lines. Protocol assumes you have a direction to move toward. He did not. The ambush had come from 3 sides simultaneously: north, east, and a flanking push from the southeast that had cut off the only withdrawal route his unit had mapped before the operation. That route no longer existed. The tree line to the west was open, but open in the Hirchen in November meant exposed no canopy cover, frozen ground that cracked under weight, sight lines that favored the men, now organizing themselves less than 400 meters away. Running west meant being seen. Running north or east meant running into them directly. The southeast was already closed. He ran the options the way he had been trained to run them. Fast, without sentiment, each one terminated at the same place. If he moved in any direction, he would be found. The forest was not large enough, and the sweep teams were already positioning. He could hear it. Not voices yet, but the particular quality of silence that forms when men are trying to be quiet and almost succeeding. The sound of controlled movement, organized, patient. These were not men in a hurry. That was the detail that mattered most. Men in a hurry make noise, take wide angles, miss things. These men were moving slowly, methodically. They had done this before. Every option available to him assumed he could outpace a coordinated sweep in terrain he did not know. In the dark, in conditions that turned every step into a liability, he could not. The math resolved itself cleanly. Movement equaled capture. Or worse, every isolated soldier before him had made the same calculation. The numbers looked wrong. Stay and be found. Move and be found. So they chose movement because movement at least felt like action, like agency, like the decision a soldier was supposed to make. They ran. Every one of them ran. He didn't. He pressed himself lower into the undergrowth, and he stopped moving, entirely, not paused, not hesitating. Stopped the way an object stops, without intention of starting again. He turned his face into the frozen ground so that his breath would not cloud above the brush line. He slowed his breathing the way he had practiced, though he had never practiced it for a reason like this. And then he did the one thing that made no immediate sense. He moved not outward, not towards safety, but back, 3 meters. Back toward the exact position where the ambush had been triggered. Back toward the last known point of contact. Back toward the place every sweep team would assume was already clear. Nobody returns to where it started. That was the premise he was betting his life on. He settled into the hollow at the base of a fallen oak. The tree had come down years before the root system had pulled partially free of the ground when it fell, creating a shallow depression on the forest floor, not deep enough to hide in, deep enough to change his silhouette from a shape that read as human to a shape that read as terrain. He pulled dead leaves over his legs. He did not move his hands. He waited. The first sweep team passed at 0 for 1-1. He heard them before he saw them. 4 men. Moving in a loose line, spaced roughly 6 meters apart. They had flashlights but were using them sparingly, which meant they had discipline, which meant they were not conscripts, thrown into the forest in a hurry. These were men who understood that light is a liability before it is a tool. They moved through his position, not near it, through it. The closest man passed within 11 feet of where he lay. He counted the footsteps without meaning to, a reflex, something his body did while his mind stayed flat and deliberate. 11 feet. The crunch of frozen leaves under a boot. A brief pause. The man had stopped. Briefly, 2 meters past him. He did not breathe. The pause lasted for seconds. Then the footsteps continued. The sweep team moved northeast, toward the withdrawal route his unit had been using, the same route that had been cut off. They were following the direction they assumed survivors would run. They were correct about where a running man would go. They had already walked past the man who wasn't running. He gave it 20 minutes before he allowed himself to shift weight. His left arm had gone numb from the elbow down. He moved it slowly, incrementally, the way you move something fragile, until sensation returned in a slow burn that he accepted without reacting to. The forest had changed in those 20 minutes. The initial organized quality of the German sweep had settled into something more routine, periodic, patterned. He could track the sound of it without seeing it. A sweep at intervals, moving outward from the contact point in expanding arcs. This was the thing he had understood before he understood it fully. A perimeter expands outward. The men searching for him were moving away from where he lay. Every minute he stayed still was a minute the search moved further from his position, not toward it. Away the center of the contact zone was becoming, by design and doctrine, the least searched place in the forest. He had not planned this precisely. He had felt its logic before he could name it. At 0448, he heard voices. 2 men, close, stationary, speaking in low German, not the careful near silence of the sweep teams, but the slightly looser register of men who had finished their assigned sector and were now waiting. They had stopped less than 30 meters to his east. He calculated the problem. They were not moving toward him, but they were not moving away. They were stationary, which meant they could remain stationary for an unknown duration. Minutes, an hour. Longer, if they had orders to hold the eastern line while other teams continued pushing west. He needed to move. Not far, not fast. He identified a position 12 meters to his north. A denser section of undergrowth. Lower canopy. Shadow that held even against the grey that was beginning to form at the horizon. 12 meters. He gave himself 6 minutes to cover it. He moved, the way water moves. No single moment of movement large enough to register as movement. Weight shifted. A hand repositioned. A knee drawn forward, 3 centimeters. A pause. Weight shifted again. 6 minutes and 40 seconds. 12 meters. The voices to his east did not change register. The light was building now. Not dawn, not yet, but the forest was losing its complete darkness, shifting into the ambiguous grey that preceded it. Objects were becoming shapes. Shapes were becoming specific. This was the most dangerous window. Dark enough that the sweep teams were still operating. Light enough that visibility was improving. The margin between a shape that looked like terrain and a shape that looked like a man was narrowing. He needed to be completely still before full grey settled. He pressed himself into the undergrowth and did not move. 4 meters to his left, a bird landed in the lower branches of a pine. It landed, adjusted its weight, and stayed. He took this as information. A bird that lands and stays is a bird that does not perceive threat beneath it. He stayed too. At 05 to 1, a sweep team returned through his sector. This one was moving faster than the first. Less methodical, the spacing between men, less precise. Either they had found nothing and were losing focus, or they were rotating teams, and the new team was less experienced. Either way, the discipline had degraded. The team moved through in under 3 minutes, sweeping northeast again. following the same outward logic that all the teams were following. He watched the last man's boots until they disappeared into the trees. Then he let 30 seconds pass. Then 30 more. He had been on the ground for 2 hours and 11 minutes. His hands were cold enough that he had stopped feeling individual fingers, and had begun feeling his hands as single units, present or absent, functional or not. He flexed them periodically, slowly, his face still turned into the undergrowth, so that the small motion would not be visible at distance. He thought about the men in his unit. He did not think about them long. There was a category of thought that was useful in a situation like this, and a category that was not. Grief belonged to the second category. He filed it there deliberately and returned to the first. What he knew, the search was moving outward, and had been for 2 hours. The teams were rotating. Discipline was degrading. The eastern stationary position had gone quiet sometime in the last 30 minutes. The men there had either moved or been reassigned. What he needed, a direction and a window. The western tree line was still the most exposed option, but exposed at 0347 was not the same as exposed at 0600. At 0558, something changed. He felt it before he could identify it. A shift in the texture of sound in the forest. The intermittent movement of sweep teams had been replaced by something more consolidated. Voices further away than before, coming from a single direction. Northeast, they were regrouping. He did not know why. A timed withdrawal. A report from higher command. A conclusion that the survivor, if there was one, had already escaped the perimeter, and further searching of the interior was a misallocation of men. Any of those reasons pointed to the same thing. The window was opening, but he did not move. This was the point at which every instinct pushed toward action. The search was pulling back. The moment felt like permission. Move now. Take the window. Do not wait for it to close. He made himself wait another 12 minutes. 12 minutes in which he tested the silence, listening for the team that might be holding position while the others regrouped. Listening for the boot on frozen ground that would tell him the window was not as open as it sounded. He heard nothing that contradicted the withdrawal. At 0614, he began to move. Not fast, not toward the western tree line, which was still the most direct route, but required crossing 40 meters of reduced cover in growing light. He moved north first, paralleling the direction the sweep teams had gone, but staying well inside the tree line, using the terrain the teams had already cleared, ground already searched as ground already dismissed. He moved in 3-minute intervals, with full stops between them. At the first stop, he identified his next position. At the second stop, he listened. At the third stop, he adjusted. He covered ground the way he had covered those 12 meters earlier, in units small enough to be deniable as movement. A shape that could be a shape, or could be a trick of the grey light in the trees. He reached the northern edge of the original contact zone at 0638. Then he heard it. A single man, moving south, toward him, through the trees at his 10 o'clock. Not a sweep team. One man, moving with the slightly irregular cadence of someone navigating terrain rather than executing a pattern. A straggler from a reassigned team. A soldier sent to check a specific reference point before the full withdrawal completed. He could not tell how far. The sound moved strangely in the trees. He stopped. He pulled himself against the trunk of a pine, and did not breathe in a way that moved his chest visibly. The footsteps came closer, closer, then angled east. The man passed 15 meters to his right without changing pace, without pausing, without looking left. He watched the figure until it was gone. He gave it 4 minutes, then he moved again. The search had operated on a doctrine so practiced, it had become invisible to the men executing it. Contact zone identified. Survivors assumed to flee. Perimeter established beyond the contact point. Sweep outward, contain, and close. The doctrine was correct for the man who ran. It assumed a man who ran. Every team had oriented outward from the start. The perimeter they built was a circle drawn around a point they had already left behind. They expanded it in the direction they believed a survivor would travel away from contact, toward friendly lines, toward the route they had used to arrive. But the contact zone itself, the exact ground where the ambush had happened, had been assigned low priority. After the first pass, it was the one place logic eliminated early. No one hides where they were found. No one returns to where the shooting started. The tactical mind dismisses it so automatically that the dismissal doesn't feel like an assumption. It feels like fact. He had stayed inside the assumption. For 3 hours, he had been in the one place on the map that the expanding search had progressively left further behind. Not a hiding place in the traditional sense, no cover deep enough to conceal him from a man standing directly above him, but a position that the logic of the search had made irrelevant. The blind spot was not a physical feature of the terrain. It was a feature of the doctrine. He had not found a gap in the forest. He had found a gap in how the forest was being read. By the time the last German sweep team consolidated northeast of his position, he was already moving through ground they had catalogued and closed. He did not run. Running generates sound. Running generates a silhouette that moves with purpose. Running tells the forest what it is carrying and where it intends to go. He moved at the pace the situation allowed, deliberate, low, angled toward a reference point he had fixed in his mind from the pre-mission map. A creek bed, 300 meters northwest, that ran toward the American-held tree line. He reached it at 0711. He followed it for 40 minutes without rising above the bank. He crossed into friendly territory at 0752. Identified himself to a forward observation post through a fence line that had been a farm boundary before the war, made it something else. He was not faster than the men looking for him. He was not better equipped. He had not found a flaw in their search by analysis or prior study of German sweep doctrine. He had simply understood at the moment the situation gave him no other option, that the expected thing and the survivable thing were not the same thing. And then he had done the harder one. After the war, he rarely spoke about that morning. Not because it had been dramatic. Most of it had been cold ground and controlled breathing, and the particular discipline of doing nothing when everything in him insisted on doing something, when he did speak of it once, to a younger man who had asked the wrong question about courage. He said only that the forest had not been the problem. The problem had been the assumption that moving was the same as surviving. East men never separated those two things. In the Hurchen, in November, in the dark, with the perimeter closing outward and the center going quiet behind it, the difference between those two things had been the only distance that mattered. He had stayed inside it. That was all.